Tracy Edwards ran barefoot through the streets of Milwaukee on July 22, 1991, his hands still cuffed in handcuffs, blood streaming from cuts on his face, terror in his eyes as he flagged down a police cruiser at the intersection of 25th and State Streets. The 32-year-old had just escaped from apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, where a soft-spoken blond man named Jeffrey Dahmer had lured him with promises of money to pose for photographs and drinks. Instead, Jeffrey had handcuffed Tracy, held a knife to his throat, and told him calmly, almost apologetically, "I'm going to eat your heart." For 4 hours, Tracy had sat in that apartment watching Jeffrey's behavior become increasingly bizarre, rocking back and forth, chanting, pressing his head against Tracy's chest to listen to his heartbeat while murmuring about how much he wanted to keep it. When Jeffrey momentarily became distracted by a television show, Tracy seized his opportunity, punched Jeffrey in the face, and ran, running for his life through the hallways of the Oxford Apartments, down the stairs, and out onto the street where he found police officers Robert Routh and Rolf Miller on routine patrol. "This guy tried to kill me," Tracy gasped, pointing back toward the apartment building. "He's got knives, and he said he was going to cut out my heart and eat it. Please, you have to help me. He's crazy." The officers, initially skeptical, domestic disputes and drug-related incidents were common in this neighborhood, decided to accompany Tracy back to apartment 213 to investigate. When Jeffrey Dahmer opened the door, he appeared completely normal, polite, cooperative, apologetic about the misunderstanding with his friend. But when officers asked for the key to the handcuffs still dangling from Tracy's wrists and began looking around the apartment, they noticed a smell, a terrible, overwhelming stench of death and decay that made their eyes water and their stomachs turn. Officer Muller opened the refrigerator looking for a beer to calm his nausea from the smell. Instead, he found a severed human head staring back at him from the bottom shelf, preserved in plastic wrap like leftover food. The discovery triggered a search that would reveal one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. A freezer containing 3 more severed heads, a filing cabinet full of Polaroid photographs showing dismembered bodies in various stages of mutilation, a blue 57-gallon barrel containing 3 torsos dissolving in acid, a closet containing a complete human skeleton painted gray, and drawers full of preserved human organs, hearts, lungs, livers, stored like trophies in jars and plastic bags. 74 Polaroid photographs documented Jeffrey Dahmer's murders in graphic detail, showing victims alive and smiling, then drugged and unconscious, then dead with their eyes open, then dismembered with their organs displayed, then their skulls cleaned and painted. This was the apartment of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, who over 13 years had murdered 17 young men and boys, had sex with their corpses, dismembered their bodies, dissolved their flesh in acid, boiled their skulls to keep as souvenirs, and ate their hearts and muscles believing it would make them part of him forever. His arrest would shock the world not just because of the brutality of his crimes, but because of how many times he had almost been caught, how many opportunities law enforcement and the criminal justice system had to stop him before he killed again, and how a seemingly normal, polite man who went to work every day at a chocolate factory and lived in an ordinary apartment building could hide such monstrous evil behind closed doors. This is the complete story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the monster next door. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, at Evangelical Deaconess Hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a 24-year-old chemistry graduate student, and Joyce Annette Flint, a 22-year-old who had recently dropped out of college. The birth was difficult. Joyce had suffered from severe anxiety and depression throughout her pregnancy, taking various prescription medications including morphine, barbiturates, and tranquilizers that doctors would later question may have affected the developing fetus. But when Jeffrey was born, he appeared to be a healthy, normal baby. Blue eyes, blonde hair, all 10 fingers and toes, weighing 7 pounds 6 ounces. Lionel and Joyce brought their firstborn son home to their small apartment near Marquette University with high hopes for his future. Dreams of watching him grow up to become a successful professional like his father. Jeffrey's early childhood seemed unremarkable, even happy by most accounts. Home movies from the period show a cheerful, energetic toddler playing with toys, smiling at the camera, interacting normally with his parents and relatives. But behind the scenes, the Dahmer household was beginning to fracture. Joyce's mental health struggles continued and worsened after Jeffrey's birth, deepening into what would now likely be diagnosed as severe postpartum depression, combined with anxiety disorder and possibly bipolar disorder. She suffered from what she called spells, periods of complete paralysis where she couldn't move or speak, lying rigid in bed for hours while Jeffrey cried in his crib. She had anxiety attacks that left her hyperventilating and bedridden for days at a time. She experienced episodes of rage where she would scream at Lionel, throw dishes, lock herself in the bathroom for hours, refusing to come out even when Jeffrey needed to be fed or changed. Lionel Herbert Dahmer, consumed by his graduate studies in chemistry and desperate to support his young family financially, threw himself into his work as a means of escape, often staying at the university laboratory late into the night to avoid the tension and chaos at home. This left young Jeffrey alone with his increasingly unstable mother for long stretches of time during his most formative years. Joyce was inconsistent in her parenting, sometimes loving and attentive, holding Jeffrey close and singing to him, other times neglectful and emotionally absent. Lying in bed for days while toddler Jeffrey wandered the apartment unsupervised, hungry, unchanged, crying for attention that didn't come. The unpredictability of his mother's affection, the absence of his father, the emotional chaos of the household, all of these factors would later be identified by psychiatrists as potential contributors to Jeffrey's developing attachment disorder and his inability to form normal emotional connections with other human beings. In 1962, when Jeffrey was 2 years old, the family moved to Ames, Iowa, where Lionel had accepted a position as a research chemist. The move was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for the family to escape the small apartment and find stability in a new place. They rented a house, Lionel had a good salary. Joyce was seeing a new psychiatrist who adjusted her medications. Everything seemed hopeful. But Joyce's mental health continued to deteriorate despite the change of scenery. She began taking higher doses of prescription medications, tranquilizers like Equinol, barbiturates, amphetamines prescribed by various doctors who didn't coordinate her care or know what other medications she was taking. The medications helped sometimes, dulling the worst of her anxiety and depression, but often made her behavior more erratic and unpredictable, swinging from catatonic withdrawal to manic energy to explosive rage within the span of hours. Friends and neighbors from this period remembered Jeffrey as a quiet, shy child who seemed nervous and withdrawn around other people. Unlike other children his age who were boisterous and outgoing, eager to play with other kids and make friends, Jeffrey preferred to play alone in his room or in the backyard, showing little interest in social interaction or group activities. Teachers at his preschool noted that he had difficulty with other children, often standing on the sidelines watching rather than participating, and that he seemed to be in his own world, staring off into space rather than engaging with lessons or playtime. One teacher wrote in a report that Jeffrey seems sad most of the time and doesn't smile or laugh like the other children. In 1966, when Jeffrey was 6 years old, Joyce gave birth to his younger brother, David. The pregnancy had been difficult. Joyce's mental health had deteriorated to the point where she spent most of the 9 months in bed, unable to function, requiring Lionel to hire help to care for Jeffrey. When David was born, he became the focus of all of Joyce's attention and energy. She poured into David all the maternal love and care that she had never been able to consistently provide to Jeffrey. Suddenly, Jeffrey found himself not just emotionally neglected, but completely ignored. His mother, who had been inconsistent, but at least occasionally present, now acted as if Jeffrey didn't exist. She fed David, changed David, held David, cooed at David, while 6-year-old Jeffrey was expected to fend for himself, to be quiet, to stay out of the way, to not make demands or need anything. This rejection, this sudden and complete loss of whatever fragile maternal attention Jeffrey had received, would later be identified by multiple psychologists and psychiatrists as a critical turning point in Jeffrey's psychological development. Dr. Judith Becker, who would later evaluate Jeffrey for the court, described this period as when Jeffrey's attachment disorder likely crystallized into something more profound and dangerous: an inability to form emotional bonds, a deep-seated rage at abandonment, and a desperate need for control that would eventually manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. Shortly after David's birth, the Dahmer family moved again, this time to Bath Township, Ohio, a rural suburb of Akron. Lionel had secured a good position as an analytical chemist at PPG Industries, and with his increased salary, the family was able to purchase their own home, a large, beautiful house on 2.8 acres of wooded land on West Bath Road. The house had 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a finished basement, and extensive woods surrounding the property. It was exactly the kind of place where an American family was supposed to thrive, where children were supposed to run and play and build tree forts and catch fireflies on summer nights. But for Jeffrey Dahmer, the isolation of the new house only deepened his growing sense of alienation and disconnection from other people. At Hazel Harvey Elementary School, Jeffrey was known as a loner. He had no close friends, didn't participate in sports or clubs, and spent recess standing by himself against the wall of the building while other children played. Teachers noted that he completed his work adequately but showed no enthusiasm or interest in learning, going through the motions mechanically without any spark of curiosity or engagement. When called on in class, Jeffrey would mumble single-word answers while staring at his desk, never making eye contact. Other children found him strange and avoided him, not out of cruelty necessarily, but because Jeffrey radiated discomfort and awkwardness that made interaction difficult and unpleasant. At home, things grew steadily worse. Lionel and Joyce's marriage was disintegrating. They fought constantly, screaming matches that would last for hours, sometimes becoming physical with shoving and throwing objects. Joyce's pill addiction was spiraling out of control. She was taking tranquilizers and painkillers at levels far exceeding prescribed doses, often being so drugged that she couldn't get out of bed for days at a time. Lionel, recognizing that his wife was addicted and mentally ill but feeling powerless to help her, buried himself deeper in his work, sometimes staying at the office late into the night or traveling for conferences just to avoid being home. This left Jeffrey and David alone in the house with their mother, who alternated between catatonic withdrawal and explosive, frightening rages. Jeffrey began spending more and more time alone in the woods surrounding the house. He would wander through the trees for hours, exploring, observing, and increasingly looking for dead things. He began collecting roadkill, animals that had been hit by cars on the rural roads near his home. At first, he simply collected them out of what appeared to be morbid curiosity, bringing dead possums, raccoons, and squirrels back to the woods near his house. But soon, Jeffrey began cutting them open, using sticks and sharp rocks at first, then graduating to actual dissection tools his father had given him. Lionel Dahmer, a scientist himself, initially saw Jeffrey's interest in dead animals as a positive sign, scientific curiosity, perhaps the beginning of an interest in biology or veterinary medicine. When 10-year-old Jeffrey asked his father how to properly preserve animal bones, Lionel showed him how to use bleach to clean bones, how to articulate skeletons, basic taxidermy techniques. Lionel even helped Jeffrey set up a small laboratory in a shed behind the house, providing him with beakers, microscopes, and dissection equipment. What Lionel didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that Jeffrey's interest wasn't scientific at all. Jeffrey wasn't dissecting animals to learn about anatomy or biology. He was dissecting them because he was fascinated by death, by the process of taking apart living things, by having complete power and control over bodies that couldn't resist or fight back or leave him. By age 13, Jeffrey had developed a routine. He would scour the roads near his house looking for fresh roadkill, or sometimes he would find animals that had died in the woods from natural causes. He would bring them to his shed, lay them out on his work table, and spend hours methodically dismembering them, studying their internal organs, removing their bones, preserving parts in jars of formaldehyde his father had provided. He became skilled at the process, learning which cuts to make, how to separate joints, how to strip flesh from bone most efficiently. He was practicing, preparing, though he didn't yet consciously understand what he was preparing for. Jeffrey also began experimenting with different methods of disposing of animal remains. Sometimes he would bury bones in the woods, arranging them in patterns or shallow graves. Sometimes he would dissolve flesh in acid. His father had taught him about acid's corrosive properties, and Jeffrey began using chemicals stolen from the school laboratory or his father's work supplies to see how quickly acid would break down organic tissue. Most disturbingly, Jeffrey sometimes impaled animal heads on sticks and placed them in the woods surrounding his house, creating macabre displays that he would return to visit repeatedly, observing how the heads decayed over time, how birds and insects consumed the soft tissue, how the skulls gradually became clean white bone. If Lionel Dahmer had investigated more closely, if he had asked Jeffrey more questions about his activities in that shed, if he had paid attention to the warning signs that his son's interest had moved from scientific curiosity to something far darker, perhaps Jeffrey's trajectory could have been altered. But Lionel was consumed with his failing marriage, with his work, with simply surviving the emotional chaos of his household. He didn't look closely. He didn't ask questions. And Jeffrey continued his experiments in death and dismemberment, completely unsupervised, for years. During his teenage years at Revere High School, Jeffrey became known as the class clown, but not in a positive, likable way. He became notorious for what students called doing a Dahmer, which involved faking epileptic seizures in hallways, making loud animal noises during class, intentionally acting drunk or mentally disabled to get reactions from other students. He would contort his body and make strange faces, speak in nonsensical babbling, deliberately drop things, and stumble into walls. His classmates found these performances bizarre and disturbing rather than funny, and while some initially laughed out of shock or awkwardness, most soon learned to simply avoid Jeffrey entirely. Underneath the bizarre behavior was a young man spiraling into alcoholism and increasingly violent sexual fantasies. Jeffrey had realized by age 14 or 15 that he was gay, though he kept his sexuality completely hidden. This was rural Ohio in the mid-1970s, where being openly gay was dangerous both socially and sometimes physically. But Jeffrey's attraction to other males wasn't normal or healthy. His sexual fantasies were never about mutual pleasure, romance, or connection. Instead, Jeffrey fantasized obsessively about having complete control over another person's body, about rendering someone unconscious so they couldn't resist or say no, about having a completely submissive partner who couldn't try to leave. These fantasies became more elaborate and disturbing as Jeffrey moved through his teenage years. He began planning in detail how he could abduct someone, drug them, keep them in a state of unconsciousness so they would be alive but completely powerless. He fantasized about having sex with unconscious or sleeping bodies, about doing things to people who couldn't fight back or tell anyone what had been done to them. And increasingly, Jeffrey's fantasies included elements of death, not because he necessarily wanted to kill, but because dead bodies were the ultimate form of control, the ultimate guarantee that someone couldn't resist, couldn't leave, couldn't reject him. By his junior year of high school, Jeffrey was drinking alcohol heavily and regularly. He brought vodka to school in bottles disguised as soda, drinking throughout the day to numb the intense self-loathing and emotional pain that consumed him. He was lonely, desperately isolated, unable to connect with anyone. He had never had a real friend, never been invited to a party, never experienced the normal teenage milestones of dating, friendship, belonging. The alcohol dulled the pain temporarily, but it also lowered his inhibitions and made his violent sexual fantasies feel more real, more possible to act on. In his senior year of high school, Jeffrey's home life completely collapsed. Lionel and Joyce's marriage, which had been deteriorating for over a decade, finally fell apart entirely. Joyce had become addicted to prescription medications to the point where she could barely function. She had affairs with multiple men, spent money recklessly, threatened suicide repeatedly, and created constant chaos and drama. In early 1978, Lionel moved out, filing for divorce and abandoning the family home on West Bath Road. The divorce proceedings were bitter and vicious, with Joyce and Lionel fighting over every asset, every piece of furniture custody of David, while completely ignoring Jeffrey. Then, in May 1978, just weeks before Jeffrey's high school graduation, Joyce made a decision that would have profound and devastating consequences. She decided to leave Ohio and move back to Wisconsin to stay with relatives. She packed up her belongings, packed up David's belongings, and she left, completely abandoning 18-year-old Jeffrey, leaving him alone in the house with no money, no food, no plan for his care. She didn't tell Jeffrey she was leaving permanently. She didn't make arrangements for him to stay with relatives or friends. She simply drove away, taking David with her, and left Jeffrey completely alone. For weeks, possibly months, Jeffrey lived alone in that empty house on West Bath Road. His father, consumed with his own emotional distress over the divorce and dealing with Joyce's constant demands for money and property, didn't realize that Jeffrey had been completely abandoned. Jeffrey stopped attending school regularly. He drank constantly, downing entire bottles of vodka, stumbling through the empty house in alcoholic stupors. He had no money. Joyce had cleaned out the bank account when she left. He ate whatever food he could scrounge from the pantry or steal from neighbors. And he spiraled into depression, rage, and fantasies that were becoming less like fantasies and more like plans. Jeffrey spent his time driving through town in the family car, watching other young men, following them, imagining scenarios where he could get them to come to the house, where he could make them stay, where he could control them. He had a specific fantasy that had crystallized into an obsession. He wanted to find a good-looking young man, bring him to the house, drug him so he was unconscious but not dead, and then just lay down next to him. Jeffrey didn't even necessarily want to have sex at this point in his fantasy. He just wanted to lie next to someone, to have a warm body next to his, to not be alone. But the fantasy required that the person be unconscious, because anyone who was conscious would eventually want to leave. And Jeffrey couldn't allow that. Leaving meant rejection, meant abandonment, meant Jeffrey would be alone again. And Jeffrey had decided, on some level, that he would never allow himself to be abandoned again. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from Revere High School, Jeffrey Dahmer was driving along a country road near Bath Township when he saw 19-year-old Stephen Mark Hicks hitchhiking. Stephen was on his way to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park, about 30 miles away. He was young, good-looking, wearing jeans and a concert t-shirt, holding his thumb out to passing cars hoping for a ride. When Jeffrey pulled over and offered Stephen a ride, Stephen didn't hesitate. Jeffrey was clean-cut, well-dressed, driving a nice car, clearly not a threat. He got in. Jeffrey told Stephen he was headed toward Cleveland and could give him a lift. They made small talk. Stephen mentioned the concert he was going to. Jeffrey said he was just out driving around with nothing to do. Then Jeffrey made an offer. Why didn't Stephen come back to Jeffrey's house for a while? They could smoke marijuana, have some beers, hang out for a bit before Jeffrey drove Stephen to the concert. Stephen agreed. He had time before the concert started, and free weed and beer sounded good. He had no idea he was making the last decision of his life. At the house on West Bath Road, Jeffrey and Stephen spent several hours drinking beer and smoking marijuana that Jeffrey had stolen from somewhere. They talked, or at least Stephen talked while Jeffrey mostly listened, about music, about Stephen's plans to attend college, about nothing particularly important. And as the afternoon wore on, as the sun began to set, Stephen said he needed to leave to make it to the concert on time. That's when Jeffrey's demeanor changed. His whole body tensed. His expression, which had been friendly and relaxed, became cold and distant. Stephen noticed the change and became uncomfortable. He stood up, said thanks for the beer and weed, said he really had to go. Jeffrey stood up too, and suddenly there was something dangerous in his eyes, something that made Stephen take a step back toward the door. "You can't leave," Jeffrey said quietly. "What?" "Dude, I have to. The concert." "You can't leave," Jeffrey repeated, his voice flat and emotionless. "I won't let you." Stephen tried to laugh it off, thinking Jeffrey was joking, but Jeffrey wasn't joking. As Stephen reached for the door handle, Jeffrey grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell from his bedroom, approached Stephen from behind, and swung it with all his strength at the back of Stephen's head. The impact made a sickening cracking sound. Stephen collapsed to his knees, stunned, blood immediately streaming from his scalp. He tried to turn around, tried to raise his hands to defend himself, but Jeffrey hit him again, and again, and again, raining blows down on Stephen's head and skull until Stephen stopped moving, until he stopped making sounds, until the floor was covered in blood, and Jeffrey was certain that Stephen Mark Hicks would never leave, never reject him, never abandon him. Jeffrey stood over Stephen's body, breathing heavily. The dumbbell still in his hand, blood spattered across his shirt and face. He had killed someone. He had actually done it. And the feeling coursing through his body wasn't horror or remorse or panic. The feeling was satisfaction, power, control, and underneath it all, a deep sense of relief. Stephen couldn't leave now. Stephen was his forever. Jeffrey dragged Stephen's body to the crawlspace beneath the house and left it there. For several days, Jeffrey visited the body repeatedly, sitting next to it, talking to it, eventually undressing it and engaging in sexual acts with the corpse. The body was his, completely his, in a way no living person could ever be. It couldn't say no, couldn't push him away, couldn't look at him with disgust or judgment. It was perfect. But eventually, as the body began to decompose and the smell became overwhelming, Jeffrey realized he had to dispose of it. Using the skills he had developed over years of dissecting animals, Jeffrey dismembered Stephen Hicks' body in the crawl space. He cut off the head, the arms, the legs. He cut the torso into pieces. Then, working methodically and without apparent emotion, he stripped the flesh from the bones, smashing the skull with a sledgehammer, breaking down the skeleton into pieces small enough to hide or dispose of easily. Jeffrey put Stephen's bones into garbage bags and buried them in the woods behind the house. He dissolved some of the flesh using chemicals. He kept the process orderly and controlled, treating it like just another of his animal dissection projects. When he was finished, when every trace of Stephen Hicks had been broken down and disposed of, Jeffrey cleaned up the crawl space, showered, and went to bed. He felt nothing. No guilt, no fear, no horror at what he had done. He felt empty. The same hollow emptiness he always felt, except now with the added knowledge that he was capable of murder, and that murdering someone had made him feel something, however briefly. Stephen Hicks' family reported him missing when he never arrived at the concert and never came home. Police investigated, interviewed his friends, tried to track his movements on June 18th, but no one had seen him after he was dropped off near the highway to hitchhike. The case went cold quickly. Stephen was just another young man who had vanished while hitchhiking, possibly a runaway, possibly the victim of foul play, but with no leads and no evidence. No one connected his disappearance to Jeffrey Dahmer. No one had any reason to suspect the quiet teenager who lived alone in the house on West Bath Road. Jeffrey should have been caught immediately. Stephen's disappearance should have triggered an investigation that included questioning everyone in the area, searching properties, checking for witnesses. But this was 1978, before DNA evidence, before widespread missing persons databases, before the kind of investigative techniques that might have connected Stephen's disappearance to Jeffrey. And so Jeffrey Dahmer got away with his first murder. And getting away with it, knowing he could do it again, knowing there was a way to prevent people from leaving him, that knowledge became the foundation for everything that would come next. After murdering Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey's life fell into a pattern of alcoholism, aimlessness, and escalating fantasies about killing again. His father, Lionel, finally realizing that Jeffrey had been living alone and abandoned, moved back into the house and tried to impose some structure on Jeffrey's life. Lionel arranged for Jeffrey to attend Ohio State University in the fall of 1978, giving him money for tuition, room, and board, hoping that college would help Jeffrey find direction and purpose. But Jeffrey was far too deep in his alcoholism and psychological disintegration to function at college. He attended classes drunk, skipped more classes than he attended, spent his days in his dorm room drinking vodka and fantasizing about killing. He flunked out after one semester, having literally accomplished nothing academically. When he returned home to Bath Township, Lionel was furious and desperate. He made Jeffrey choose, either get a job and support himself, or join the military where structure and discipline might straighten him out. Jeffrey chose the military, enlisting in the Army in December 1978. He completed basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama, and was assigned to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, as a medical specialist. The Army provided exactly what Lionel had hoped for: structure, routine, expectations. For a brief period, Jeffrey functioned relatively well. He showed up for duty on time, completed his assignments competently, stayed out of major trouble. But he continued drinking heavily whenever he had opportunity, and his fellow soldiers found him odd and antisocial. He had no friends, didn't socialize, spent his free time alone in his barracks drinking and retreating into his fantasies. In March 1981, after serving 2.5 years, Jeffrey was discharged from the Army. The official reason given was unsuitable for military service due to his alcohol use, though Jeffrey would later claim to biographers that he had also struggled with his homosexual urges while in the military and had engaged in sexual activity with other soldiers, though these claims were never verified. Regardless, Jeffrey was released and sent back to Ohio with no plan, no prospects, and nowhere to go. Lionel Dahmer had remarried by this point to a woman named Sherry Jordan, and Jeffrey was not welcome to live with them. Lionel instead bought Jeffrey a ticket to Miami, Florida, giving him some money and essentially sending him away with vague hopes that Jeffrey would find work and start a new life. But Jeffrey, alone in Miami with no job and no support system, quickly ran out of money. He survived by sleeping on the beach, stealing food, and calling his father repeatedly begging for money to come home. Finally, in September 1981, Lionel arranged for Jeffrey to move to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where Jeffrey's grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, lived. Catherine, a devout woman in her 70s, agreed to let Jeffrey live with her rent-free while he got on his feet. She lived in a nice house in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee, and she hoped that living with family in a stable home might help Jeffrey turn his life around. Jeffrey lived with his grandmother from 1982 through 1988, and during those years, he maintained a facade of normalcy that concealed the monster he was becoming. He got a job at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center, drawing blood from donors and processing samples. Later, he worked at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, a job he would hold for 6 years, working the night shift mixing chocolate. His grandmother found Jeffrey to be polite, quiet, and helpful around the house. He mowed the lawn, did repairs, ran errands. She had no idea what Jeffrey was doing in the basement of her house late at night, or what he was bringing home in bags and boxes after his nocturnal wanderings through downtown Milwaukee. During this period from 1982 to 1987, Jeffrey's fantasies about killing again intensified to an obsessive degree. He frequented gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee, picking up men for sexual encounters, but he was never satisfied with consensual sex. What Jeffrey wanted was control, submission, possession. He wanted partners who couldn't say no, or resist, or leave. He began experimenting with drugging men he brought home, slipping sleeping pills into their drinks, but he miscalculated dosages multiple times, either not drugging them enough or drugging them so heavily they became suspicious and left. Jeffrey also committed a series of crimes during this period that should have resulted in his arrest and imprisonment long before he killed again. In August 1982, Jeffrey was arrested at the Wisconsin State Fair for exposing himself to a crowd of people, including children. He was charged with disorderly conduct, fined $50, and released. In September 1986, Jeffrey was arrested again for masturbating in public in front of two 12-year-old boys near the Kinnickinnick River. He was charged with lewd and lascivious behavior, convicted, placed on 1 year of probation, and required to register as a sex offender. If authorities had taken this pattern of escalating sexual offenses seriously, if they had recognized Jeffrey as a dangerous predator in the making, if they had investigated more thoroughly, but they didn't. Jeffrey completed his probation without incident, and the sexual offender registration was essentially meaningless because there was no follow-up or monitoring. On September 15, 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer killed for the second time, 9 years after murdering Stephen Hicks. The victim was 26-year-old Stephen Walter Tuomi, a young man Jeffrey met at a gay bar called Club 219 in downtown Milwaukee. Jeffrey and Stephen spent the evening drinking together, and Jeffrey suggested they continue the party at a nearby hotel, the Ambassador Hotel. Stephen agreed, and they checked into room 507. Jeffrey drugged Stephen's drink with sleeping pills, intending to simply render him unconscious so he could do whatever he wanted to Stephen's body without resistance. But something went wrong. Jeffrey would later claim that he didn't intend to kill Stephen Tuomi, that he had only wanted to drug him and assault him, but that when he woke up the next morning, Stephen was dead, either from the drug overdose or from being suffocated or strangled while unconscious. Jeffrey claimed he had no memory of killing Stephen, that he had blacked out from alcohol and woke up to find a corpse in the hotel bed with him. Whether this version of events was true, or whether Jeffrey was lying to minimize his culpability, would be debated by forensic psychiatrists for years. Regardless of how Stephen Tuomi died, Jeffrey woke up on the morning of September 16th with a dead body in a hotel room and a problem to solve. Rather than panic or call police, Jeffrey calmly went to a store and purchased a large suitcase. He returned to the hotel, stuffed Stephen's body into the suitcase, checked out of the hotel, and took a taxi back to his grandmother's house, carrying the suitcase containing the corpse as if it were nothing more than luggage. If the taxi driver or hotel staff had any suspicions about the heavy suitcase or Jeffrey's demeanor, they never reported them. At his grandmother's house, Jeffrey took the body to the basement and dismembered it over the course of several hours, using skills he had perfected 9 years earlier with Stephen Hicks and refined through years of dissecting animals. He cut off Stephen Tuomi's head, arms, and legs, separated the torso, stripped flesh from bone. He put the flesh and organs into garbage bags and disposed of them in the household trash, which was collected before anyone could discover what was inside. He smashed the skull and major bones with a sledgehammer, reducing them to fragments that he also threw away. Within 24 hours, every trace of Stephen Tuomi had been disposed of, and Jeffrey had once again gotten away with murder. Stephen Tuomi's family reported him missing, but the investigation went nowhere. He had last been seen leaving Club 219 with an unknown man, but no one could provide a detailed description, and there were no witnesses to what happened after they left. The case went cold. Jeffrey Dahmer had killed for the second time, and once again, the criminal justice system had failed to catch him. The murder of Stephen Tuomi marked the beginning of Jeffrey Dahmer's true killing spree, Between September 1987 and July 1991, Jeffrey would murder 15 more young men, refining his techniques, escalating his depravity, and somehow evading detection despite multiple encounters with police and a pattern of behavior that should have triggered serious investigation. This was the period when Jeffrey transformed from someone who occasionally killed to satisfy his twisted need for control into a serial killer operating with terrifying frequency and brutality. After disposing of Stephen Tuomi's body in September 1987, Jeffrey didn't kill again for several months. He later told psychiatrists that he tried to resist the urges, tried to go back to his life of quiet desperation without murder. But the fantasies consumed him. Every day at work at the chocolate factory, he thought about killing. Every night in his grandmother's basement, he obsessed over how to find another victim, how to bring them to the house, how to kill them without being caught. The fantasies had become needs, compulsions he couldn't control no matter how much he drank or how hard he tried to distract himself. On January 16, 1988, Jeffrey picked up 14-year-old James Edward Dockstader outside Club 219, the same gay bar where he had met Stephen Tuomi. James was a Native American boy who looked older than his age and who frequented the area around the gay bars, sometimes engaging in prostitution to earn money. Jeffrey offered James $50 to come back to his grandmother's house to pose for photographs and have drinks. James agreed. $50 was more money than he usually made, and Jeffrey seemed harmless enough, just another closeted gay man looking for company. At the house, Jeffrey gave James drinks heavily laced with sleeping pills. When James passed out, Jeffrey strangled him manually, squeezing his throat until James stopped breathing. Then, Jeffrey dismembered the body in the basement, using the same methodical process he had perfected with his previous victims. He kept James's skull, boiling it to remove the flesh and then bleaching it white. Jeffrey would later tell police that he kept the skull because he wanted something to remember James by, wanted a physical reminder that James had been real, had been his, even if only briefly. The disposal of James Dockstader's remains presented new challenges. Jeffrey couldn't simply throw body parts into his grandmother's household trash. The risk of discovery was too high, especially as neighbors had begun complaining about strange smells coming from the basement. Instead, Jeffrey began experimenting with different methods of disposal. He dissolved some flesh and organs using muriatic acid stolen from his workplace. He smashed some bones to powder using a sledgehammer. He buried other parts in shallow graves in his grandmother's backyard late at night when she was asleep, and he kept the skull hidden in a box in his bedroom, taking it out occasionally to look at, to touch, to remind himself that he had power over life and death. James Dockstader was reported missing by his family, but the investigation went nowhere. A 14-year-old Native American boy who associated with the gay community in downtown Milwaukee was not a priority for law enforcement in 1988. Racist and homophobic attitudes within the police department meant that James's disappearance was treated as a probable runaway case rather than a possible abduction or murder. No one connected his disappearance to Jeffrey Dahmer. No one investigated the houses of men who were known to frequent the area where James was last seen. The case went cold within weeks. On March 24, 1988, just 2 months after killing James Dockstader, Jeffrey picked up 23-year-old Richard Guerrero outside a gay bar. Richard was from a Mexican-American family, had dropped out of school, and worked occasional construction jobs to support himself. Jeffrey used his standard approach, offering money for photographs and drinks, and Richard agreed. The murder followed the same pattern: drinks with sleeping pills, strangulation after Richard passed out, dismemberment in the basement, acid disposal of most of the remains, keeping the skull as a trophy. Richard Guerrero's family immediately knew something was wrong when he didn't come home. Richard lived with his mother and siblings, and it was completely out of character for him to disappear without contacting them. His mother filed a missing persons report, spoke to local media, put up flyers throughout Milwaukee. But despite her efforts, the investigation stalled. Richard had last been seen in the gay district of downtown Milwaukee, and police, again demonstrating the homophobic attitudes prevalent at the time, treated his disappearance as less urgent than if he had been a straight white teenager from the suburbs. After murdering Richard Guerrero, Jeffrey's grandmother, Catherine, began to seriously question what was happening in her basement. The smells were getting worse, chemical odors mixed with what seemed like rotting meat. She found stains on the concrete floor that looked like blood. When she confronted Jeffrey, he claimed he had been dissecting animals he found already dead, pursuing an interest in taxidermy. Catherine, a devout woman who loved her grandson and wanted to believe the best of him, accepted this explanation, though she remained troubled. But in September 1988, Catherine's concern reached a breaking point when police contacted her about an incident involving Jeffrey. On the night of September 25, 1988, Jeffrey had lured a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Somsak Sintha Somphone to his grandmother's house with an offer of money for posing for photographs. Jeffrey gave the boy drinks laced with sleeping pills and began undressing him, photographing him in various poses. But Jeffrey miscalculated the drug dosage. Instead of rendering the boy fully unconscious, the drugs made him groggy and confused but still capable of movement. The boy managed to escape the house and flag down police, telling them a man had drugged him and assaulted him. Police went to Catherine Dahmer's house and arrested Jeffrey. The case was investigated, and prosecutors charged Jeffrey with second-degree sexual assault of a child and enticing a child for immoral purposes. Jeffrey was released on bail, and the case slowly moved through the court system. Catherine Dahmer, horrified by the charges and increasingly convinced that something terrible was happening in her basement, told Jeffrey he could no longer live with her. Lionel Dahmer intervened, arranging for Jeffrey to move into an apartment of his own in downtown Milwaukee while the criminal case against him proceeded. In May 1989, Jeffrey pled guilty to the charges involving Somsak Sintha Somphone. At his sentencing hearing in May 1989, Jeffrey's attorney Gerald Boyle argued for probation, characterizing the incident as a terrible mistake by a man struggling with alcoholism and homosexuality. The prosecutor pushed for prison time, presenting the case as predatory behavior toward a child. Judge William Gardner sentenced Jeffrey to 5 years in prison but stayed the sentence, instead placing Jeffrey on 10 years of probation with the requirement that he serve 1 year in a work release program and register as a sex offender. This was one of many critical failures of the criminal justice system in Jeffrey Dahmer's case. He had been convicted of sexually assaulting a 13-year-old child, but instead of serving real prison time, he was given probation and work release. If Judge Gardner had sentenced Jeffrey to actual prison time, if the system had recognized Jeffrey as the dangerous predator he was, then the 15 murders that would occur over the next 2 years could have been prevented. But the system failed, and Jeffrey remained free to kill. Jeffrey served his work release at the Milwaukee County House of Correction from May 1989 to March 1990. During the day, he worked at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. At night, he returned to the correctional facility. The restrictions prevented him from killing during this period, but the fantasies intensified. Jeffrey spent his nights planning his next murders, thinking about how to refine his techniques, how to prevent future victims from escaping like Somsak Sintha Somphone had. In March 1990, Jeffrey was released from work release and moved into his own apartment at the Oxford Apartments, a low-rent building at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The apartment was apartment 213, a small one-bedroom unit that would become the site of the most horrific serial murders in American history. The Oxford Apartments housed mostly poor residents, many of them recent immigrants or people struggling with addiction and mental illness. The building had problems with noise, crime, and general neglect. It was exactly the kind of place where a serial killer could operate with minimal scrutiny from neighbors or management. Almost immediately after moving into apartment 213, Jeffrey began killing again, and the frequency of his murders accelerated dramatically. Between May 1990 and July 1991, a period of just 14 months, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 12 young men, averaging nearly one murder per month. This escalation is typical of serial killers who have perfected their methodology and become increasingly compulsive and desperate in their need to satisfy their violent urges. On March 25, 1990, Jeffrey picked up 24-year-old Edward Warren Smith, known as Eddie, at a bar. Eddie was from Milwaukee, had struggled with homelessness and drug addiction, and was looking for money. Jeffrey offered him cash to come to the apartment for drinks and photographs. Eddie agreed. The murder followed Jeffrey's established pattern: drugged drinks, strangulation, dismemberment. But Jeffrey added a new element. He kept Eddie's skull and painted it gray to preserve it, and he kept photographs of the entire murder and dismemberment process, documenting his crime in graphic detail. On May 20, 1990, Jeffrey picked up 23-year-old Raymond Lamont, Ricky Smith, at a club. Ricky was known for his love of dancing and fashion, a vibrant personality who dreamed of becoming a model. Jeffrey lured him to apartment 213 with promises of a modeling gig and payment. Jeffrey drugged Ricky, strangled him, had sex with the corpse, dismembered the body, and kept the skull. He took photographs of Ricky at every stage: alive, drugged, dead, dismembered. These photographs would later be found by police and used as evidence of Jeffrey's crimes. On June 14, 1990, Jeffrey picked up 27-year-old Edward Dwayne Smith, known as E.D., from outside a bar. E.D. was from Chicago, visiting Milwaukee when Jeffrey approached him with his standard offer. E.D.'s murder followed the same pattern, with Jeffrey keeping the skull and taking extensive photographs. The murders were coming faster now, the gaps between them shrinking. Jeffrey later told psychiatrists that the urges had become overwhelming, that he thought about killing constantly, that the only relief came immediately after a murder, when he could have complete control over a body that couldn't reject or abandon him. But the relief was temporary, lasting only hours or days before the compulsion returned stronger than ever. On September 2, 1990, Jeffrey picked up 22-year-old Ernest Marquez Miller, known as Ernest, at a bus stop. Ernest was from Chicago, had aspired to be a dancer, and was visiting Milwaukee when he encountered Jeffrey. Jeffrey drugged Ernest, strangled him, dismembered him, and kept his skull. He also kept Ernest's jewelry and identification, studying the ID carefully, learning everything he could about the person whose life he had just taken. On September 24, 1990, Jeffrey picked up 23-year-old David Courtney Thomas from the Grand Avenue Mall. David had a girlfriend and a child, was working to support his family, when Jeffrey approached him with an offer that seemed too good to refuse: money just for posing for some photographs. David's girlfriend would later tell police that David was excited about the opportunity to earn extra money, that he had no idea he was walking to his death. Jeffrey killed David using his standard method and kept the skull, boiling it and painting it to preserve it. By late 1990, Jeffrey's apartment was becoming a charnel house. The small one-bedroom unit contained multiple skulls hidden in boxes and drawers, a freezer filled with body parts including severed heads and organs, a filing cabinet containing hundreds of Polaroid photographs documenting his murders, and a blue 57-gallon barrel in which Jeffrey was dissolving 3 torsos in acid. The smell was overwhelming. Neighbors complained constantly about chemical and rotting odors coming from apartment 213. Building management received reports of strange sounds: power tools running at odd hours, loud thumping and banging, muffled screams. But when they confronted Jeffrey, he always had explanations. He was a taxidermist working on animal specimens. His freezer had broken and meat had spoiled. He used strong chemicals for his hobby. And the management, more concerned with rent collection than with investigating suspicious activities, accepted these explanations. On February 18, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 17-year-old Curtis Durrell Strotter, known as Curtis, from a bus stop near Marquette University. Curtis was living on his own, working odd jobs when Jeffrey approached him. Curtis was handsome, charismatic, the kind of young man Jeffrey fixated on. Jeffrey lured Curtis to apartment 213, drugged and murdered him, and kept his skull and hands as trophies. On April 7, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 19-year-old Errol Lindsay from near a bar where Errol was waiting for a friend. Errol was engaged to be married, excited about his future, when Jeffrey convinced him to come to apartment 2B13 for drinks. Jeffrey's murder of Errol followed the standard pattern but with one horrifying addition. Before killing Errol, Jeffrey attempted one of his twisted experiments. Jeffrey wanted to create a compliant, zombie-like partner who would never leave him, never reject him, but would still be technically alive. He had been reading about lobotomy procedures and had decided to try creating his own version. After drugging Errol until he was barely conscious, Jeffrey used a power drill to drill a hole in Errol's skull. Then, using a turkey baster, Jeffrey injected muriatic acid directly into Errol's brain, attempting to damage the frontal lobe and create a state of complete submission. Errol died from the procedure, whether from the trauma, the acid, or both, and Jeffrey dismembered the body as usual. But the experiment had failed, and Jeffrey was frustrated. He would try again. On May 24, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 31-year-old Anthony Tony Lee Hughes, a deaf and mute man who communicated using sign language and written notes. Tony was at a bar when Jeffrey approached him and communicated using written notes, offering Tony money to model. Tony, who was interested in modeling, agreed and went with Jeffrey to apartment 213. The murder of Tony Hughes was particularly tragic because Tony's disability meant he had no way to call for help or to communicate his distress. Jeffrey drugged Tony, strangled him, and kept his skull. Tony's family reported him missing immediately, but the investigation yielded no leads. On May 27, 1991, just 3 days after killing Tony Hughes, Jeffrey encountered 14-year-old Konarak Synthosophone on a street corner near the Oxford Apartments. Konarak was the younger brother of Somsak Synthosophone, the 13-year-old boy Jeffrey had assaulted in 1988. Konarak didn't know who Jeffrey was or that Jeffrey had previously victimized his brother. When Jeffrey offered Konarak money to pose for photographs, Konarak agreed and followed Jeffrey to apartment 213. What happened next would become one of the most infamous failures of law enforcement in American history. A failure so egregious that it would lead to the resignation of the Milwaukee police chief and changes in police procedures nationwide. Jeffrey drugged Konarak and began drilling into his skull to inject acid, attempting his zombification experiment again. But Jeffrey miscalculated the dosage of drugs, and Konarak regained partial consciousness. While Jeffrey was out buying more beer, Konarak managed to escape the apartment, stumbling out into the street, naked, bleeding from his rectum, incoherent and clearly in distress. 2 young black women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, found Konarak on the sidewalk and immediately called 911. When police officers John Balkerzak, Joseph Gabrish, and Richard Parubkhan arrived on the scene, the 2 women explained that the boy appeared to have been drugged and assaulted, that he was obviously in trouble and needed help. But before the officers could fully assess the situation, Jeffrey Dahmer arrived, calm and composed, and explained that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had been drinking and had an argument, and that everything was fine. The officers, rather than conducting a proper investigation, accepted Jeffrey's explanation. They refused to listen to Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, who insisted something was seriously wrong. They refused to believe Konarak was a minor, despite his obvious youth. They didn't check his identification. They didn't check Jeffrey's identification or run his name through the system. If they had, they would have discovered Jeffrey was a registered sex offender on probation for child sexual assault. They didn't search apartment 213, where they would have found a decomposing corpse in the bedroom and evidence of multiple murders. Instead, officers Balcerzak and Gabrish escorted Konarak back to Jeffrey's apartment, returned him to his killer, and left after spending a few minutes in the apartment despite its overwhelming smell. Within an hour of police returning Konarak to him, Jeffrey strangled the 14-year-old boy, had sex with his corpse, dismembered his body, and kept his skull. The police officers who returned Konarak to Jeffrey Dahmer were later found guilty of gross negligence and fired from the police department, though they successfully appealed their termination and were reinstated. The incident remains one of the most shocking examples of police incompetence and indifference to the lives of marginalized people in American criminal justice history. On June 30, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 20-year-old Matt Cleveland Dion Turner from a bus stop near Marquette University. Matt was visiting Milwaukee from Chicago when Jeffrey approached him. Jeffrey murdered Matt using his standard method and kept his skull and identification. On July 5, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 23-year-old Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberger, known as Jeremiah, from a gay bar called Carol's Speakeasy in Chicago. Jeremiah was from Puerto Rico, had been living in Chicago, and accepted Jeffrey's invitation to spend the weekend in Milwaukee. Jeffrey and Jeremiah spent 2 days together before Jeffrey drugged Jeremiah on July 7th and attempted another lobotomy experiment, drilling into Jeremiah's skull and injecting boiling water into his brain. Jeremiah died from the procedure, and Jeffrey kept his head in the freezer. On July 15, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 24-year-old Oliver Joseph Lacey from a street corner. Oliver was from Chicago, was the father of 2 young sons, and had accepted Jeffrey's offer of money. Jeffrey murdered Oliver on July 15th, kept his head in the freezer, and kept his heart in the refrigerator intending to eat it later. On July 19, 1991, Jeffrey picked up 25-year-old Joseph Arthur Breithoft from a bus stop. Joseph was married with 3 children but was estranged from his family and struggling with employment. Jeffrey murdered Joseph on July 19th and kept his head in the freezer and his torso in the blue barrel of acid. By July 22, 1991, Jeffrey's apartment contained the remains of 11 different victims in various states of decomposition and preservation. The freezer held 4 severed heads. The refrigerator held a human heart. The blue barrel contained 3 torsos dissolving in acid. The filing cabinet held hundreds of Polaroid photographs documenting the murders. Boxes throughout the apartment contained 7 skulls that Jeffrey had boiled, bleached, and painted to preserve them as trophies. And on that night, July 22nd, Jeffrey lured 32-year-old Tracy Edwards to apartment 213, intending to make him victim number 18. But Tracy Edwards fought back. When Jeffrey handcuffed Tracy and held a knife to his throat, Tracy didn't freeze or submit. He talked to Jeffrey, keeping him calm, watching for an opportunity. When Jeffrey became distracted watching a television show, Tracy punched him in the face, breaking Jeffrey's glasses, and ran from the apartment. Tracy's escape led to Jeffrey's arrest, the discovery of the horror inside apartment 213, and the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year killing spree. When officers Roth and Meller discovered the human head in Jeffrey's refrigerator, Jeffrey initially attempted to flee, but the officers subdued him and placed him under arrest. Detective Dennis Murphy arrived on the scene and began coordinating the investigation of what would become one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The FBI was called in to assist. The medical examiner's office sent teams, photographers, evidence technicians, detectives. Eventually, over 100 law enforcement personnel would be involved in processing apartment 213. The discoveries inside the apartment were beyond comprehension. The 4 heads in the freezer belonged to Oliver Lacey, Joseph Breithoft, Jeremiah Weinberger, and Matt Turner, killed within the previous 3 weeks. The torsos in the barrel belonged to Oliver Lacey, Joseph Breithoft, and Ernest Miller. The 7 painted skulls hidden throughout the apartment belonged to earlier victims. The filing cabinet contained 74 Polaroid photographs showing victims at every stage: alive, drugged, dead, dismembered, their organs displayed for Jeffrey's camera. The photographs proved premeditation and documented Jeffrey's complete lack of remorse or humanity. Jeffrey was transported to the Milwaukee County Jail and interrogated by Detective Dennis Murphy and FBI Special Agent Greg McCrary. In a calm, monotone voice showing no emotion, Jeffrey confessed to 17 murders over 13 years, Stephen Hicks in Ohio in 1978, and 16 victims in Wisconsin between 1987 and 1991. He provided details that only the killer could have known: where he had met each victim, how he had killed them, what he had done with the bodies, which skulls and photographs belonged to which victims. He described his cannibalism matter-of-factly, explaining that he had cooked and eaten parts of several victims because he believed consuming their flesh would make them part of him forever, would prevent them from truly leaving him. The confession took over 60 hours spread across multiple days. Jeffrey never asked for a lawyer. He seemed almost relieved to finally tell someone what he had done, to unburden himself of secrets he had carried alone for 13 years. But throughout the confession, Jeffrey showed no remorse, no empathy for his victims or their families. He described the murders clinically, like describing a recipe or a scientific procedure. The detectives found his lack of emotion more disturbing than the graphic details of the crimes themselves. The media frenzy surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest was unprecedented. The story dominated national and international news for weeks. Reporters descended on Milwaukee, interviewing neighbors from the Oxford apartments, tracking down Jeffrey's former classmates and co-workers, trying to understand how a serial killer had operated undetected for so long in a major American city. The revelations about the police officers returning Conorak Synthosom phone to Jeffrey generated particular outrage, with protests outside the Milwaukee Police Department and calls for the chief's resignation. Jeffrey was charged with 15 counts of first-degree murder. He was not charged with the murders of Stephen Tuomi and Stephen Hicks because no physical evidence remained, and Jeffrey's confession alone was insufficient under Wisconsin law. The trial was set for January 1992, and Jeffrey's attorney Gerald Boyle faced an impossible task: defending a client who had confessed to horrific murders with overwhelming physical evidence to support every charge. The only possible defense strategy was an insanity plea. Boyle would argue that Jeffrey Dahmer was legally insane at the time of the murders, suffering from mental illness so severe that he could not understand that his actions were wrong, or could not control his behavior. If the jury accepted the insanity defense, Jeffrey would be committed to a mental institution indefinitely, rather than sentenced to prison. If the jury rejected the insanity defense, Jeffrey would face multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. The trial began on January 30, 1992, before Judge Lawrence Graham at the Milwaukee County Courthouse. The prosecution was led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann and Assistant District Attorney Judith Becker. The courtroom was packed every day with media, family members of victims, and members of the public desperate to understand how Jeffrey Dahmer had become a monster. The prosecution's case was straightforward: present the overwhelming evidence of Jeffrey's guilt, prove he knew his actions were wrong, and demonstrate he was a cold, calculating killer who deserved prison. They presented the Polaroid photographs showing victims at various stages. They presented the victims' skulls and body parts that Jeffrey had kept. They presented testimony from Tracy Edwards describing his near-death experience. They presented Jeffrey's own confession in which he described every murder methodically and without emotion. The defense called multiple psychiatrists who examined Jeffrey and concluded he was insane. Dr. Frederick Berlin testified that Jeffrey suffered from necrophilia so severe it constituted mental illness. Dr. D. Judith Becker testified that Jeffrey's attachment disorder and inability to form emotional bonds were evidence of serious psychological dysfunction. Dr. Carl Wallstrom testified that Jeffrey's cannibalism was evidence of a psychotic break from reality, but the prosecution countered with their own psychiatric experts who testified that Jeffrey was not legally insane. Dr. Park Dietz, one of America's foremost forensic psychiatrists, testified that Jeffrey knew right from wrong, understood his actions were criminal, took steps to avoid detection, and was capable of controlling his behavior when necessary. Dr. Dietz explained that having paraphilias, abnormal sexual interests like necrophilia and cannibalism, did not constitute legal insanity. Many people have paraphilias but don't commit murder because they understand it's wrong and have sufficient impulse control. Jeffrey Dahmer, Dr. Dietz testified, chose to commit murder, chose to indulge his desires rather than resist them, and understood perfectly well that he was committing terrible crimes. The most dramatic testimony came when Jeffrey himself took the stand. In a soft, emotionless voice, Jeffrey described his crimes in graphic detail. He explained how he felt empty inside, how killing temporarily filled that emptiness, how he believed keeping parts of his victims would prevent them from leaving him. But under cross-examination by the prosecution, Jeffrey admitted he knew murder was wrong, admitted he took steps to hide his crimes, admitted he lied to police and neighbors to avoid detection. These admissions destroyed the insanity defense. If Jeffrey knew his actions were wrong and took steps to hide them, he could not claim he was legally insane. After deliberating for only 5 hours, the jury returned their verdict on February 15, 1992, guilty on all 15 counts of first-degree murder. The jury rejected the insanity defense, determining that Jeffrey Dahmer was a sane man who had chosen to commit horrific crimes. Judge Graham sentenced Jeffrey to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years in prison with no possibility of parole. Jeffrey was transported to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, to begin serving his sentence. Prison officials placed him in protective custody due to threats from other inmates and the high-profile nature of his crimes. Jeffrey adapted to prison life surprisingly well. He was polite and cooperative with guards, completed his assigned work duties, and spent his time reading, exercising, and claiming to have found religion. But on November 28, 1994, less than 3 years into his sentence, Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered by a fellow inmate. Jeffrey had been assigned to work detail with 2 other prisoners, Christopher Scarver, a convicted murderer serving a life sentence, and Jesse Anderson, also serving life for murder. Left unsupervised in the prison gymnasium for approximately 20 minutes, Scarver attacked Jeffrey and Anderson with a metal bar from exercise equipment, beating both men to death. Scarver would later claim he killed Jeffrey because he was disgusted by Jeffrey's crimes and because Jeffrey had been taunting other inmates by shaping his food into body parts and using ketchup as fake blood. Jeffrey Dahmer died at the age of 34, killed by the same kind of violence he had inflicted on 17 young men. His father, Lionel, received the news by phone and later said he felt a sense of relief. Relief that Jeffrey could no longer hurt anyone. Relief that the families of victims wouldn't have to endure decades of parole hearings. Relief that the nightmare was finally over. The impact of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes extended far beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. The case exposed serious failures in multiple systems. Law enforcement that ignored complaints and returned a drugged child to his killer, the criminal justice system that gave probation rather than prison time to a convicted child molester, building management that ignored complaints about terrible smells and suspicious activities, mental health systems that failed to identify and treat a deeply disturbed individual before he became violent. The families of Jeffrey's victims were left to cope with unimaginable loss and trauma. Most of the victims were young men of color, Black, Latino, Asian, from working class or poor backgrounds. Many had struggled with homelessness, addiction, or economic hardship. They were exactly the kind of victims that society often overlooks and undervalues. Their families fought for years to ensure their loved ones were remembered as people, not just as Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, people with dreams, talents, families who loved them, futures that were stolen from them. The case also forced a national conversation about homophobia in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. The fact that so many victims were gay or bisexual men, and that their disappearances were not taken seriously by police, highlighted how discrimination and prejudice can literally be deadly. If police had investigated more thoroughly, if they had taken missing persons reports more seriously, if they had checked Jeffrey's background when they returned Conorak to him, many lives could have been saved. Today, Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. His name has become synonymous with depravity, cannibalism, and the monster hiding in plain sight. But we must remember that the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just about one evil man. It's about the systems that failed to stop him, the prejudices that allowed his victims to be overlooked, and the 17 young men whose lives were stolen from them by a killer who cared about nothing but satisfying his own twisted needs. Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Doc Stater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Conorak Synthasimphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. May their memories be honored. May their families find peace. And may the systems that failed them be reformed so that no future Jeffrey Dahmer can operate with such devastating impunity for so long.